The morning they brought the crown down from the mountain, Kale Vorash counted 7 elders on the processional path and decided she trusted none of them. She stood at the edge of the Ashborn settlement's outer wall, a rough ring of blackstone and hammered iron that her grandfather had built with his own hands, back when the tribe still had enough hands to do such work. The wall was shorter than she was. She'd grown past it 2 years ago, the summer she turned 16, when the Ashborn blood had finally surged through her fully and added 8 inches to her frame, and turned her eyes from muddy brown to the pale amber that marked a war-blooded air. She remembered standing next to the wall in the early morning and laughing, just laughing, because it was absurd. She had spent her entire childhood imagining this wall as vast and permanent, as the border between the settlement's known world and everything she hadn't yet experienced, and now she could see over it without trying. The crown of Vor sat in a sealed reliquary box carried by Elder Vorath, whose arms trembled visibly under its weight. The case itself was nothing remarkable, black iron with copper fittings, sealed with a pressure lock that hadn't been opened in 11 years. The trembling in Vorath's arms was not from the weight of it. She understood that. He'd been carrying the anticipation of this moment for a long time, and anticipation was heavier than iron. She watched him from the wall and said nothing. Behind her, from inside the longhouse, she heard her mother singing. The song was human. Everything her mother sang was human. Lyra had grown up in the river settlements 300 kilometers north, where the orbital station's light sometimes caught the water at dawn and turned the whole river silver, where the children ran to the banks to watch the alien sky shimmer, and nobody thought of it as alien because it had been the sky for as long as anyone could remember. Lyra Vorash, née Masson, had wandered south at 22 following a cartographer's contract that had evaporated somewhere between the mountain pass and the first Ashborn settlement she'd walked into. She'd stayed because of the mountains, she always said. She'd stayed because of Kale's father, which was what she meant when she said the mountains. She sang the way river settlement humans sang, low, melodic, with rhythms that felt syncopated to Ashborn ears, that resolved on beats that weren't quite where you expected. Kale had grown up hearing those songs in her sleep, had learned them phonetically before she understood the words, had understood the words before she understood the feelings, and had understood the feelings gradually over the years like someone learning to read by living inside a book. She looked at the crown's reliquary box. She looked at Vorath's trembling arms. She looked at the 6 other elders arranged in careful precedence behind him, and she mapped their faces the way she'd learned to map faces. Not reading emotion so much as reading commitment, the specific tilt of someone who had made a decision, and was following through versus the tilt of someone who was still deciding. 5 of the 6 had already decided. Seta was still watching, which was different from deciding. Then Kale walked inside to find her mother. Lyra was at the central hearth, grinding grain the old way. The Ashborn had grinders that ran on the settlement's solar cells. Mora had installed them 3 seasons ago, and they ran clean and quiet and required almost no maintenance. But Lyra preferred the stone, said the rhythm helped her think. She was small by Ashborn standards, small by any standard, with the kind of compact stillness that came from a life spent being the least physically imposing person in every room she'd ever occupied. She had learned, early and thoroughly, that stillness was its own kind of presence. She had Kale's same wide jaw, translated into human proportions. She had Kale's same eyes, or rather Kale had hers, amber, wide-set, habitually calm in the way that meant not the absence of feeling but the presence of someone who had decided feeling did not require display. "They're here," Kale said. "I know." Lyra didn't stop grinding. The stone made its familiar sound, the one Kale associated with early mornings, and the smell of flour and her mother's voice carrying the chorus of whatever she'd been humming since before she was fully awake. I could hear Vorath's procession from the northern pass. He always overstaffs his ceremonies, makes himself feel safer. He brought all 7 voting elders. Then it's unanimous. Kale sat down on the hearthstone beside her mother, which required folding significantly to accomplish. At 18, the full Ashborn growth had completed itself. She stood 2.5 meters at the shoulder in what the elders called resting posture, considerably more in the battle swell that came when the blood rose, which it hadn't done yet in any real conflict because her life so far had not required it. Her tusks had come in clean and straight, which Voreth had once described as a good omen. She had not punched him for it, though she had thought about it, and she thought about it again briefly now. "I don't want the crown," Kale said. "I know. If I take the crown, I leave." Lyra's hand slowed on the grinding stone but did not stop. "Yes, that's the tradition. A crowned Vor doesn't stay in the settlement. They go to the high seat, the mountain hold. Alone or with the formal court. Never with—" She stopped. The sentence had run into something she hadn't quite prepared for, which was the simple physical reality of her mother's hands on the stone, the smell of grain, the song that had been playing in the background of every meaningful moment of her childhood. She tried again. "Never with the people they actually love, not the family you were born to, not the one that made you." Lyra set down the grinding stone. She turned on the hearthstone so that she faced her daughter fully, and Kale was struck, as she always was, by the pure physical incongruity of it. Her mother could fit in the hollow of Kale's cupped hands, and yet nothing about the woman suggested smallness. She had the bearing of someone who had decided long ago that stature was entirely irrelevant to the question of who occupied a room. "Your father was asked," Lyra said. 3 years before you were born, he refused. He chose us. He chose the settlement, the life here, this wall he built with his hands. I have never once in 18 years heard him say a word that sounded like regret. He gave up the mountain hold. He gave up a title. He kept everything worth keeping." She paused. "I'm not saying that's what you should do. I'm saying that choosing has always been possible in this family." Kale was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the procession reaching the inner gate. She could hear Voreth calling her name in the formal register. Old Ashborn, the language of ceremony, the language of the mountain hold that she'd been taught by her grandmother in evening sessions that had smelled like pine resin and old books, because her grandmother had been clear about what it meant to be born both things at once. "But I didn't choose not to enter the chamber," she said quietly to the fire. "The way the old stories say, it wasn't a principled stand. It wasn't obedience or wisdom or whatever Voreth likes to call it in the ceremony tongue." Her mother waited. "I was 12, you were sick. The medic had run one scan and the results were unclear, and I turned around on the road because I needed to be with you. Not because I understood the implications of it. Not because I was making a philosophical statement about what matters more than power. I was 12 and frightened, and you were my mother, and I turned around." "Yes," Lyra said. And when the crown identified that as the choosing, when Voreth stood up in the council and said that a Vor heir had demonstrated the quality of heart the old compact requires, that someone had chosen love over power in a moment of unscripted sincerity, he was right about what I did and completely wrong about why I did it. Her mother reached up. She had to reach considerably up and put her hand flat against Kale's jaw. The hand was warm and grain-dusty, and very small against the broad planes of Kale's face, and it was the most familiar thing in Kale's world. "Sometimes those are the same thing," Lyra said. "Doing the right thing because you're frightened and don't have time to think it through. The feeling and the choice arriving at the same moment. That's not a lesser kind of deciding. That might be the truest kind." Kale closed her eyes. She held the feeling of her mother's hand against her face, and she let herself be 12 for approximately 3 seconds, frightened and small and certain only that this was what mattered. Then she opened her eyes, squared her shoulders, and went to meet the elders. Elder Voreth was a tall Ashborn, taller than most, though Kale had surpassed him by half a meter at 15, and showed no signs of remembering this in any way that would make him comfortable. He wore the formal gray and copper that marked the voting council, and he carried the reliquary box with the practiced care of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years, and was now inside it, finding that it felt different from the rehearsal in ways he couldn't quite identify. His eyes, when they found Kale's, were bright with something she spent a moment categorizing: pride, she thought, or the thing that looked like pride from a distance, but was actually the specific relief of a man who had been waiting a long time to hand something off. The other 6 elders arranged themselves in a careful arc behind him. This was planned. She could see the planning in the spacing. They had measured it, probably in the formal courtyard of the elder house before the procession began, making sure the arc read as ceremony and not as encirclement. Kale stood in the open ground between the longhouse and the settlement's central post, and she felt the eyes of the entire settlement on her. Everyone was here. She could see her Aunt Mora near the smithy, one forge hand still resting on the bellows, her expression combining professional interest with the particular pride of someone who knew they were watching history being made in their immediate family. She could see the children from the eastern quarter perched on the stone wall behind the well, jostling each other for position, 4 of them. The eldest couldn't be more than 9. She could see the 2 young traders from the commerce district who'd asked her last month, with impressive directness, whether there would be positions in the Mountain Hold's household for people who weren't Ashborn by blood. She could see her father at the back of the crowd. He was doing the thing he always did when he was proud of her and didn't have the structure to contain it, slightly hunched shoulders, as if making himself smaller could prevent her from noticing the enormity of what he felt, hands clasped in front of him, the same hands that had built the outer wall and the longhouse gate and the hearthstone where she just sat with her mother. He raised one hand when he caught her looking, a single wave. She turned back to Voreth. "The crown of Vor has been in the vault keep for 11 years, Voreth began, falling into the formal register the way a river falls into a channel it's been carving for decades, naturally, inevitably, without effort. Since the last Vor passed to the mountain. Since the line lay fallow and the hold sat empty on the high peak, watching the seasons come and go without a voice to speak the old words." He glanced at the reliquary box, then at Kale. "We have waited for the choosing. The choosing has been made. Kale Vorash, daughter of Dak Vorash and the human Lyra Masson, you are called to receive the crown and take your seat at the—" "I know what I'm called to," Kale said in plain speech, not ceremony tongue. The ripple that moved through the assembled elders was small but readable. Vorath's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the specific microsecond of recalibration that comes when you've planned a speech and the situation has taken a different road. "The ritual demands." "The ritual can wait 30 seconds, she looked at him steadily. "I want to ask you something first." Voreth closed his mouth. He looked like someone who had arranged every stone of this path and was now watching a stream reroute itself around his arrangement. "What happens to my mother," Kale said, "when I go to the Mountain Hold? Specifically, not in the general terms of tradition, tell me specifically what her position in this settlement becomes the day I leave." Silence, the kind that is weight. "She stays here," Voreth said after a measured beat, "in the settlement, as she always has, as the consort's wife." "As the Vor's mother," Kale said, "which means what in practical terms? What changes? What are her resources, her standing, her daily reality?" "She would have the same standing she has now: resources, housing, respect." "She would be separated from her daughter," Kale said, and her voice was perfectly even, which took effort. "From the only family she has within 300 kilometers. She came here for my father and she stayed for us, and she has given up the river settlements and her childhood friends, and the entire physical context of her first 22 years to build a life in Ashborn country, which is not her country, and which she has made beautiful anyway because that's what she does with everything she touches. And you're asking me to take the crown and walk away from her and call it tradition." I've read the tradition," Kale said, cutting him off without raising her voice. More carefully than you have, I suspect, because I've had 6 years to do it and strong personal motivation. Seta. She turned to the third elder on the left, the one she'd trusted since she was 7 years old, and had come to Seta with a question about the settlement's water rights compact, and found that Seta had answered her with the actual complexity of the situation, rather than a simplified version appropriate for a child. The original compact of the mountain hold, the foundational document, not the ceremony layer interpretations. What does it say about the Vor's personal household and who lives within its walls? Seta's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did, a recognition, a respect, the quality of paying attention that sharpened slightly. That the Vor's household is sovereign within the mountain hold, Seta said, her voice carrying the precise, unornamented quality of someone who had memorized these documents not for ceremony but for use. That no external authority, not the Elder Council, not the settlement compact, not any agreement predating the Crown's activation, governs who resides within its walls. That choice belongs entirely to the Vor. And has any document since then, any modification, amendment, or supplementary compact passed by this council or any prior council, changed that sovereignty? No. Kale turned back to Vorath. So the tradition does not require me to leave my family behind. The tradition requires me to go to the mountain hold and take the seat and wear the crown and do the work. Whether my family comes with me, all of them, any of them, the human ones and the Ashborn ones and the ones who are both, is my choice, sovereign within the walls, ungoverned by this council as written. She paused for exactly one beat. I'm not refusing the crown. I'm accepting it. But I'm accepting it on terms that the compact explicitly provides, and that you omitted from today's presentation, presumably because it didn't occur to you that a Vor would want to bring a human mother to a mountain hold. She let that land. It should have occurred to you, she said, with something that was not unkindness but was not warmth either. It's been occurring to me for 6 years. The silence that followed had a different texture from the earlier one. This one was not the weight of something held back. This was the sound of water finding a new level. Seta spoke first. The compact permits it. The elder to her right, an older man named Gorham, whose expression had been unreadable since Kale had started speaking, said nothing for 3 slow seconds. Then it was not the custom. Customs change, Kale said. My existence is evidence of that. Vorath looked at her for a long moment. His expression had moved through several states and was now resting somewhere she hadn't expected. Something that wasn't protocol, wasn't ceremony, wasn't the management of a complicated situation. She thought it might be the first genuinely unscripted thing she'd seen on his face since he'd arrived. He opened the reliquary box. The crown of Vor was smaller than she had expected. She'd been building it in her imagination for 18 years, layering onto it the weight of every story she'd heard, and every ceremony she'd observed, and every morning she'd looked at the mountain hold on its high peak and thought about what it meant. In reality, it was a low circlet of black iron set with amber stones, Ashborn amber, which was not actually amber, but a crystallized resin from a species of tree that no longer grew in the South Country, the color of old lantern light. It sat in the box's velvet-lined interior like something that had been waiting for a specific person and had been prepared to wait as long as necessary. Kale reached out and picked it up. It was cold, then slowly, impossibly, it was warm. She set it on her head. It fit as if it had been made for her, which she supposed, in some sense, it had been. She looked at her father, still at the back of the crowd, still with his shoulders slightly hunched, still doing the thing. She held his gaze for one long moment and watched him unclasp his hands and straighten, slowly, to his full height. She had never understood completely what it was about her father's pride that moved her so. It wasn't as though he hid it particularly well. It wasn't as though he rationed it or used it as currency the way some parents did. He was simply, consistently proud of her in a way that seemed to embarrass him slightly, as if he'd been handed something too large for the available container and was doing his best. She had inherited that from him. She was certain of it now. "The mountain hold," she said, to Vorath and to the assembled elders and to the whole watching settlement, speaking in plain speech because she wanted everyone to hear it without needing ceremony tongue to understand. "Needs a cook who knows how to make river settlement grain bread, the kind with the seeds pressed into the top. It needs someone who can read Terran script for the trade correspondence, which none of the traditional court positions accounts for because the trade correspondence started arriving in Terran script 40 years ago and nobody updated the staffing model. My mother has both those skills and is, as of this moment, a permanent resident of the mountain hold, sovereign household, my choice." She looked at the assembled crowd, not just the elders now. "Anyone with objections can bring them to the hold's formal hearing process, which I'll establish in the first month. Until then, we have a procession to complete." Nobody objected out loud. The silence held for a moment, and then the eldest of the watching children on the wall let out a sound that started as a whoop and became general commotion, and someone near the forge started hitting something rhythmically, and the procession formed itself again around Kale almost without effort, the way a river forms itself around a stone that has decided to stay. The first month at the mountain hold was work. The hold had been empty for 11 years, and it had opinions about this. The Ashborn built for permanence. The mountain stone was cut in interlocking blocks that required no mortar. The archways built with the particular geometry that distributed weight across the face of the mountain, rather than concentrating it. But permanence in mountain conditions required maintenance, and 11 years without it had left the hold making its complaints in the language of seal failures, water infiltration, and a heating system that had been mid-repair when the last Vor had died, and had remained mid-repair ever since. Kale spent the first week doing inventory, not of the hold's contents. There was a list for that somewhere in the vault records, and she'd get to it, but of the people she'd brought and the specific shape of their competencies. Her father knew the mountain hold's structure because he'd done repair work here before Kale was born, back when the last Vor was in residence, and the hold had needed a master builder's assessment. He knew where the weight-bearing issues were, and which parts of the repair list were cosmetic, and which were load-bearing in ways that could become serious. Her Aunt Maura was the best engineer in the southern settlements, by a margin she found slightly embarrassing to discuss, and within 2 days of arriving at the hold, she had disassembled the heating system's problematic junction and rebuilt it from component principles, not from the incomplete repair notes, which she described as theoretically interesting and practically useless. The 2 young Ashborn from the eastern quarter, a sister and brother named Vel and Taryn, who had asked to come with the specific directness of people who know exactly what they want, turned out to be, respectively, a gifted logistics organizer and someone who had been informally maintaining the settlement's water system for 3 years, and had strong opinions about mountain altitude flow dynamics. Seta had come without explanation, and had spent her first week reading through the vault records, with the focused attention of someone catching up on a very long story. Lyra had arrived, looked at the hold's grain stores, and started making bread. The bread was, within a week, the most discussed single fact about the mountain hold among the people who lived there. There was something about the altitude, Lyra said, or the particular mineral content of the mountain spring water, or the stone hearth, which drew differently from any hearth she'd used before. Whatever the cause, the bread came out with a specific quality of crust and crumb that made people stop what they were doing when they smelled it and find reasons to be near the kitchen. Kale's father ate 3 slices the first morning, and then sat at the kitchen table looking quietly overwhelmed in the way he did when something good had happened that he hadn't planned for. On the 14th day, Kale was alone in the vault room, the inner chamber where the hold's records were kept, where the Crown's reactivation protocols were archived alongside 40 years of administrative correspondence that she was slowly working through, when she heard Vorath's procession arrive at the outer gate. She recognized his footstep in the courtyard. He had a specific way of walking in formal situations, deliberate, measured, the walk of a man who wanted to be perceived as certain even when he wasn't. She heard it bouncing off the mountain stone in a way she suspected he hadn't anticipated when he'd planned whatever this visit was. She kept reading, let him wait. When she emerged to the outer terrace, Vorath was standing with his 6-person entourage arranged behind him, and his expression had settled into the specific controlled neutrality that was his compensation for having waited in a cold courtyard for 20 minutes. "Vorath," she said, with the particular neutrality she'd been developing for these interactions, not coldness, not warmth, the register of someone who is paying attention but hasn't yet decided what the situation requires. "What's the urgency?" "The Crown's lenses," he said. She went very still. The Crown's lenses were the reason the Crown was more than a circlet of iron. The amber stones set into it, 9 of them, the central one larger than the others, were not decorative and had never been. They were what the old records called analytical stone, crystallized cognition, the Ashborn equivalent of an intelligence-gathering system in a form that could be worn and moved and hidden in plain sight. They map power structures. Not power in the abstract, not force or wealth or rank, but the actual living architecture of who held influence and how, who had made agreements with whom, which of those agreements were honored and which were under strain, where obligation flowed and what it was worth. The Ashborn had built them before the colonial period, in the time when the Voran Empire had first become a serious presence in the southern territories, and their function was specific: to give the Vor of Vor a clear view of the actual world, not the world as represented in official correspondence. They had been disabled when the last Vor died. Protocol: a disabled crown passed to a new Vor was safer than an active one. Active lenses in the wrong hands could do considerable damage, and the period between Vors was always a period of instability. Kale had been working to understand the reactivation protocols for 2 weeks. "What about them?" she said. "Elder Gorham's hold box was broken into last night," Vorath said. The controlled neutrality in his voice had something underneath it, something that had been contained for a while and was now, for the first time, being given a partial outlet. "One of the auxiliary lenses, the one from the lower vault cache, that Gorham was keeping in trust on behalf of the council, is missing." Kale looked at him carefully. Gorham himself reported this. His household reported it this morning. They found the hold box broken. Gorham was not present. "And where is Gorham now?" The shift in Vorath's expression when he answered this question was the most informative thing he'd done since arriving. "That," he said, "is the second matter. Elder Gorham has not been seen since 2 days ago." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the mountain behind his head, at the cold clear sky, at the reliquary box he was still carrying. Habit, she realized. He carried it as a comfort object without being aware he was doing it. "Come inside," she said. "You should probably also tell me how long you've known." She came back to the settlement 3 days later, against her own instincts and against Seta's advice, and against what felt like basic operational sense, because someone needed to and because she was the one with both the standing to do it without triggering a council crisis and the specific knowledge of who she was going to find and where. She left the crown at the hold, which was a decision she made and then unmade and then made again, and then unmade a second time before finally deciding to bring it after all, because the crown was not, she had concluded, a symbol of authority. It was a tool for seeing clearly, and she was walking into a situation where she needed to see clearly more than she needed to be cautious. Her father came with her without being asked, which was the way he usually came to things. "You don't have to," she said, on the mountain pass road. the cold air carrying the smell of high-altitude scrub and far-off snow. "I know," he said. They walked in silence for a while. Her father was not a fast walker by Ashborn standards. He had a ground-covering gait that was reliable and consistent, and had never in her memory varied based on terrain or weather or mood. And she'd been trying to outpace it since she was 7 without ever managing it. "Gorham is the traitor," she said. "I know. You've known for how long?" 3 months. I had suspicions, nothing I could prove." Voreth knew longer. "Yes." He walked 3 more paces before adding, "He told me last night, after your meeting." Cale did not stop walking, though she wanted to. "He told you last night." "Not me." "He told me because he thought I could manage the information in a way that—" Her father paused, and she recognized the pause. He was choosing between 2 versions of the truth, and choosing the less comfortable one. "He thought I could prepare you for it without triggering a response that outpaced the evidence. He was managing me." "Yes." "Through you." "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. There was something that wanted to be anger about it, and she noted the anger without feeding it, the way Seta had taught her when she was 11. Feel it, name it, don't let it drive. "What does Voreth think Gorham's actual goal was?" she asked. Her father let out a long breath. "He thinks Gorham was frightened. The colonial administration's eastern branch has been making quiet movements in the South Country for the last 3 years. Not overt, not anything you could point at in a formal complaint, but the kind of movement that looks, to someone watching carefully, like preparation. Boundary surveys, licensing requests that establish precedent, trade agreements that contain language about regional administrative authority that sounds procedural until you read it 3 times. Gorham was watching that. And he thought, Voreth thinks he genuinely thought, that if the crown came online and the Vor of Vor started mapping the actual power structure of the South Country, the colonial administration would see it as a provocation and accelerate. That having the lenses go dark, or having them in administrative hands where they could be controlled, was safer than having an 18-year-old Ashborn heir activate full intelligence mapping on colonial territory. Cale was quiet for a long time. The settlement came into view around the pass road's last turn, the familiar outline of it, blackstone walls and forge smoke, and the solar panels on the longhouse roof catching the afternoon light. "He was wrong," she said. "Yes." He was also probably right that an 18-year-old activating full intelligence mapping on colonial territory is something the colonial administration would find alarming. "Yes," her father said, "he was right about that part." Which means the question isn't whether to activate the lenses. The question is what I do with them once they're active, and whether the colonial administration has any reason to believe I'll use them constructively rather than as leverage. Her father looked at her sideways. "That," he said, with the particular warmth in his voice that she'd been hearing her whole life, "is a more sophisticated analysis than I had at 18. You were not the Vor at 18. "No," he said, "I was building walls." She caught Gorham at the eastern relay point before the handoff could be completed. He was there, as she'd predicted from the correspondence she'd found in his settlement hold box. The secondary one, the one his household hadn't known about, which Voreth had found after Cale had told him exactly where to look. Gorham was at the relay point's inner meeting room, which was a low stone building with good light and bad acoustics, negotiating with a representative from the Voron Colonial Administrative Office who turned out to be not a simple courier, not a field agent, but a mid-level coordinator from the Eastern Branch, the kind of bureaucratic rank that specialized in what the colonial administration called information commerce. Gorham had 3 auxiliary lenses in a case beside him, wrapped in cloth. He was mid-sentence when Cale came through the relay point's outer gate with her father on her left and Seta on her right. He saw her and went quiet. The colonial representative turned. They were a tall, pale carapaced Voron, the deep-orbital variety, someone who'd grown up at low gravity, with the slow blink and measured movements that came from a body that had learned economy of motion. They looked at Kale with a particular quality of attention that she recognized immediately as the attention of someone who has just understood that the situation they planned for is not the situation they're in. The Vor herself, they said in trade tongue, this is unexpected. Put the lenses back in the case and close it, Kale said to Gorham in plain speech, as if the representative had not spoken. Gorham's hands moved to the case. He didn't open it, he didn't close it, he held it. Kale, he said, in old Ashborn, not ceremony tongue, the older register, the one from before ceremony tongue was codified, the one her grandmother had taught her, the one that had no formal versions of anything. I know what you were trying to do, she said, in the same register. You can tell me all of it when we're back in the settlement. Right now I need you to close the case. He closed the case. The representative said, carefully, in trade tongue, the elder Gorham and I were engaged in a formal commerce negotiation. The items in question are not the elder Gorham's to negotiate with, Kale said, and now she turned to the representative fully and gave them her complete attention. They belong to the crown of Vor, which is me. They were distributed to the elder council in trust for safekeeping, with the understanding that they would be returned when the crown was activated. The activation is in progress. She paused. I don't think you were told that. The representative blinked slowly. We were given to understand that the transition was incomplete, that the lenses were still. You were given to understand, Kale said, what Gorham wanted you to understand, which was that there was an opportunity. He wasn't entirely wrong. There was an opportunity. The opportunity was for the Vor of Vor to clarify, very early in her tenure, what kind of relationship the Mountain Hold intends to have with the colonial administration's eastern branch. She reached up and pressed her thumb against the center stone of the crown. Not fully, she hadn't completed the activation protocol yet, and this was not the moment she'd planned for it. But the stones were responsive now, partially online, and what they gave her in that half-connected state was something she hadn't expected. Not a map, not information, but a texture. The feeling of the room's relational architecture, rough and immediate, like holding a compass that's pointing but not yet settling. She felt Gorham's relief. It was enormous and complicated and underneath everything else in the room. He'd been carrying this for months, and he was, in this moment, glad to be found. She felt the representative's recalibration, the rapid internal adjustment of someone who had prepared for a transaction and was now in a conversation, who understood that the power differential in the room had just changed significantly. She looked at the representative. Your branch has been operating in the South Country on the assumption that the empty Vor seat meant an absence of coordination among the Ashborn settlement network, she said. That assumption was reasonable, based on what was visible. It was also wrong. The settlements have been coordinating. The old compact relationships have been maintained. The trade agreements that exist between settlements have been honored and built upon, quietly, without a formal Vor to ratify them, because the people who live here understood what the old structures were for even when the ceremonial layer was absent. The representative said nothing. Crown's lenses, when fully activated, Kale continued, will map that existing network. What I do with that map is an open question. I could use it as leverage. I could use it to renegotiate the administrative boundary agreements that have been quietly disadvantaging the South Country settlements for 40 years. I could share it with your administrative branch as a gesture of cooperative intent, which would tell you things about regional power flows that you currently don't know and would find useful. She paused. Or, and this is what I'd actually prefer, your branch could contact the Mountain Hold through official channels, and we could have a formal conversation about what a productive relationship between the Vor of Vor and the colonial administration actually looks like. One that doesn't require an elder of the settlement council to sell his people's intelligence infrastructure in order to manage his own fear. The representative was quiet for a long moment. Then they looked at the case with the 3 lenses, then back at Kale. Official channels, they said carefully, might be the appropriate approach. Yes, Kale said, I think so too. The representative picked up their travel case. They said something brief and low to Gorham. She caught the register but not the words, which she thought was probably intentional. And then they left through the outer gate, and she heard their transport start up beyond the wall, and then there was silence. She sat down across the table from Gorham. He looked in that moment like someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just put it down, and the putting down had not felt the way he'd expected it to feel. Tell me, Kale said, everything you were afraid of. He told her. It took a long time. She listened without interrupting, which was harder than she'd expected and more important. Seta listened also. Her father stayed near the door, which was where he preferred to be, and said nothing. By the time Gorham finished, the light through the relay point's single window had moved from afternoon into early evening. Kale sat with what she'd heard for a moment, not processing it the way she processed logistics or documents or formal arguments, but sitting with the texture of it, the complicated human shape of a bad decision made from a real fear by someone who hadn't trusted that the new Vor could handle what he couldn't. The council hearing will be formal, she said. You'll need to give this same account and the council will decide what it means for your seat. I won't prejudge that. She looked at him. But I need you to know something first. Whoever told you that an 18-year-old Ashborn heir with a human mother and no experience of formal governance couldn't handle the colonial administration? You believed them over me, and I'd never given you a reason to doubt me, and that's the part that you'll need to answer for. Gorham looked at her. I didn't doubt you, he said. I doubted that you'd have time to learn before they moved. Then you should have told me, she said, and trusted me to learn faster. The hearing was held 10 days later, in the Longhouse's back chamber, and it was not what Kale had imagined a formal council hearing would be. It was quieter than she'd expected, slower, more human in its texture. A long accounting that took most of a day, that circled back on itself as people remembered things in the order that they remembered them rather than the order that was logical, that ended not in drama but in exhaustion. Gorham gave his account fully. He had not been selling out the crown to the colonial administration out of profit motive. He had been negotiating, or trying to negotiate, attempting to reach an arrangement that would give the administration enough of what they wanted to prevent them from taking everything, buying time for the transition that he'd feared would move too slowly. He had not told anyone, because he'd believed he was protecting people who didn't have the context to protect themselves. The council voted to remove him from his seat. They offered him a settlement pension and residential standing. He accepted both. He didn't appeal. He looked, at the hearing's end, the way Kale had expected him to look, lighter. Voreth came to find her in the outer hall afterward, while she was waiting for her father to bring the horses for the ride back up to the hold. You managed the relay point well, he said. You should have told me about Gorham when you first had suspicions. Yes, he said it without deflection, which she appreciated. I was trying to manage the transition, keep variables contained. I'm not a variable, she said, and I'm not in transition, I'm the Vor. She looked at him. I don't need to be managed, Voreth, I need to be informed. There's a difference, and it matters. He was quiet for a moment. Your mother, he said then, in the hold, is she? Happy, Kale said. She fixed the acoustics in the upper chamber by hanging a set of woven screens she made herself from mountain fiber. She's growing grain in the East Terrace garden that she says won't mature until next summer, but she's planting it anyway because that's the kind of person she is. She sings at 3 in the morning, and the stone carries it through the whole hold, and it wakes my father up, and he lies there and listens to it, and doesn't go back to sleep until it stops. She paused. I should have been worried about how she'd adapt. I wasn't because I know her. I was right not to be. Voreth looked at her for a long moment. Good, he said, and this time what was in his voice was not protocol or ceremony or the management of a complicated situation. It was simply the word said plainly, meaning what it said. The lenses came fully online 3 weeks later. Kale was alone in the vault room when it happened, alone with the documents, with the reactivation protocols, with the particular quality of mountain-hold silence that wasn't really silence at all, but the aggregate of small sounds that the stone carried. Wind in the upper passages, the heating system's steady hum since Mora had fixed it, her mother's voice somewhere in the residential wing singing something slow and familiar. She pressed her thumb against the center stone. The activation was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no sound from the crown itself, no sensation of power flooding into her the way the story suggested. What there was instead was a shift, a change in how the room felt, as if something that had been slightly out of focus had resolved, and she was seeing the same room but more of it, more of its actual texture. The map the lenses gave her was not a map of geography. It was a map of relationship, the actual living architecture of the South Country's network of obligation and trust and shared resource and old debt, which was more complex and more extensive than anyone who hadn't lived inside it for a lifetime could have guessed. She could see where the settlement compacts overlapped and where they created tensions. She could see the fault lines that the colonial administration's 40 years of presence had introduced, the places where old relationships had been redirected around administrative requirements, adapting rather than breaking. She could see Gorham's fear in the map, the specific places where the colonial presence had been quietly strengthening its grip, not dramatically, not in any way that would trigger a formal complaint, but steadily, the way water finds its way through stone. She sat with the map for a long time. Then she called in Seta and Vel, who had turned out to have a gift for pattern recognition that made her invaluable for exactly this kind of analysis, and the 2 human traders who could read the map's colonial period overlay through the lens of their commerce district experience. They worked through the night. Her mother brought bread at 2 in the morning and left it without comment and went back to whatever she'd been doing, which was probably fixing something. By morning, Kale had 3 documents: an analysis of the current situation, a proposed approach to the colonial administration that Seta described as ambitious, and the 2 traders described as achievable, and a list of priorities for the first formal hold-to-administration contact. She sent a courier to the colonial administration's Eastern Branch office with a formal communication requesting an official meeting at the mountain hold, at the Vor's convenience, to discuss the establishment of a productive regional relationship. The language was precise, the register was formal without being ceremonial, and it contained, buried in its final paragraph, a single line that referred without elaboration to the fact that the Crown of Vor had completed its activation protocol and was fully operational. The response arrived in 4 days, which was faster than she'd expected. The Eastern Branch would be delighted to send a senior representative at the Vor's earliest convenience. She read the response twice and then sat with it for a moment, listening to her mother's voice carrying through the stone, and thought about 12-year-old Kale turning around on the road and not knowing what she was doing and doing it anyway. She thought she understood now, a little better, why that had been the choosing. Not because it was wise or principled or philosophically considered, but because in that moment she had known without knowing that she knew what mattered most, and she had moved toward it without calculation. She was still doing that. She hoped she was always still doing that. The spring trading season brought the first formal delegations, and with them the colonial administration's senior representative, a different appointment than the coordinator at the relay point. Someone with the bearing and the deep gravity stillness of a much more senior rank. Kale received them in the hold's outer hall, which was deliberate. The formal chamber existed and she would use it, but not for this first meeting. The formal chamber was about ceremony, and she decided early that what the colonial administration needed to understand first was not her ceremony but her household, the actual working reality of what the mountain hold had become in 4 months. The outer hall, when the senior representative arrived, contained Kale, wearing the crown, in a chair that was large enough for an Ashborn and had been there since before she was born. Her father, leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, which was his unobtrusive stance, and which had never once succeeded at making him unobtrusive. Mara, who had come back for the week because she wanted to look at the heating system again, and who had not technically been invited to the meeting, but was clearly not leaving. Vel and Taryn at the side table with the ledgers and the correspondence files. Seta in the corner with no particular visible purpose, and the specific quality of presence that meant she was listening to everything. And Lyra at the work table, going through the spring trade correspondence with the particular focused attention she brought to documents. The senior representative stopped in the doorway, took in the room, did the recalibration. We were given to understand, they said carefully in trade tongue, that the Vor of Vor conducted affairs through traditional channels. The previous holders of the position conducted affairs through traditional channels, Kale agreed. I work with my household. This is my household. She indicated the room without gesture, just the fact of it, the assembled people in their actual positions doing their actual work. You're meeting all of them at once, which is efficient. The representative looked at Lyra, who had not looked up from the correspondence. The trade compact revision we proposed, the representative said, beginning the formal agenda, the actual reason for the meeting, the business that both parties had come to discuss. Has a section on grain transport levies, Lyra said, still reading, that references an administrative ordinance that was superseded 4 years ago. Someone on your side didn't update the template. She looked up. We should probably start there since it affects the pricing in the next 3 sections. The representative blinked. You're the Vors. Her mother, Lyra said pleasantly, and the hold's correspondence administrator, and the person who has been reading colonial administrative documents for 30 years, because they were part of my cartographer's training and I never stopped finding them interesting. She set the document on the table and folded her hands. Shall we start with the levy section? They started with the levy section. Kale leaned back in her chair and let her mother and Vel and Seta handle the first 2 hours, which was exactly right. She listened and mapped and understood the texture of the colonial administration's actual position, which was, the lenses confirmed, considerably more anxious than their formal manner suggested, because their eastern branch had just come through an internal review and needed demonstrable progress in regional relationship building to justify their budget allocation. They needed this meeting to go well. She understood that. She was willing to give them a meeting that went well, on terms that were fair rather than exploitative, because she was not interested in making the colonial administration her enemy. She was interested in making them her counterpart, a different relationship, one that had to be established clearly at the beginning and maintained carefully afterward. When the levy section was resolved, and Vel had noted the revised figures in the ledger with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been expecting exactly this outcome, Kale leaned forward. There are 47 active compact relationships in the South Country Settlement Network, she said, and she felt the room adjust around the number, the senior representative going slightly still, Seta's expression not changing but her attention sharpening. The Crown has mapped them. Not all of them are in good order. Some have been under strain from external pressure, some from internal drift, some from simple neglect. I'm going to spend the next year addressing them. She looked at the representative. Some of what I'm going to do will intersect with your branch's operations in the South Country. I'd like those intersections to be coordinated rather than accidental. That's what this meeting is about. The representative was quiet for a moment, Coordinated, they said, not subordinated. Correct, Kale said. The Vor of Vor's authority in the South Country is not subordinate to the colonial administration. It is also not interested in unnecessary conflict with it. Those two things can be true at the same time. Another long moment. Then the representative did something she hadn't expected. They looked at her father, still against the wall, as if seeking a reference point. Her father said nothing. He looked back with the expression of someone who has nothing in particular to prove. Yes, the senior representative said finally to Kale, they can. The meeting lasted most of a day. By the end of it, 3 compact revisions were drafted. One was tabled for further review, and a framework for quarterly coordination meetings had been agreed upon in principle. The representative left with something that Kale's lenses registered as genuine relief. Not the relief of someone who'd gotten what they wanted, exactly, but the relief of someone who'd found that the situation was manageable, that the new Vor was not going to be a crisis. She was going to be, if anything, something they hadn't prepared for, someone who actually knew what she was doing. After the delegation left, Kale stood on the outer terrace for a while in the early evening air. The mountain was the mountain, unchanged, high, cold, enormous in the specific way that made every human problem feel correctly scaled against it. The hold's lights were beginning to come on in the windows behind her. She heard her mother's voice, distant, carrying through the stone from somewhere inside. The song was new, one she'd been learning, that Vel had taught her, a South Country Ashborn Orc song with a river settlement rhythm underneath it. The two things braided together until neither one was quite itself, and the result was something that hadn't existed before. She listened to it for a moment. She pressed her thumb against the center stone of the crown and let the map fill in around her. The network of the South Country, the webs of relationship and obligation and trust, the places where the year's work would be hard, and the places where it would be easier than expected. It was not a simple map. It was not a map that offered certainty or clear answers or a guarantee that the right choice would always announce itself in time. It was, she thought, a map of a world full of people doing the same thing she was doing, trying to keep their families together, trying to protect the things they'd built, making decisions from fear and love and incomplete information and doing their best with what they had. She had grown up thinking that taking the crown would mean becoming something other than what she was. That power would require her to leave herself behind along with her family, to become ceremony and protocol and a title, the Vor of Vor in place of Kale, who had turned around on a road at 12, because she couldn't imagine being anywhere else when her mother was sick. She had been wrong about that. She was still Kale. She was still the person who had turned around on the road. She was wearing a crown that told her where the obligations were and which ones mattered, and the first thing it had confirmed, in every analysis it gave her, was the same thing she'd already known. The obligations that mattered were the ones you chose. The love that mattered was the kind that turned you around. She went inside, where her mother was singing and her father was washing the meeting day cups and Seta was reading by lamplight, and Mora was doing something to the heating system again, and she sat down at the kitchen table and asked if there was bread left, and Lyra said yes, and put a piece in front of her, warm, with seeds pressed into the top. The mountain hold settled into evening around her. The crown of Vor sat on her head, cold iron and old light doing its work. She did hers.